Fallout continues from a week of deadly protests in Gaza. More than 60 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli fire this week, leading the Prime Minister Theresa May to urge Israel to show restraint. Israel says Gaza's ruling militant group Hamas is using the protests to carry out attacks. So who's responsible for rising tensions in this region? To discuss, I'm joined now by the Jerusalem Post's Knesset reporter Lahav Harkov and the Palestinian journalist Nour Odeh. Thank you both very much for talking to us. Lahav, let's talk to you first. Stones and wire cutters against live rounds and tear gas. Many in the outside world don't see this as a particularly fair fight.
Stones and wire cutters are only part of the story. There's also fire bombs and other projectiles, flaming projectiles that have been burning down Israeli agricultural land. The Israeli response to these riots, by the way, they're not protests. They're violent riots and an attempt to break down Israel's border, internationally recognized border. We're not talking about the disputed land of the West Bank here. It's basically the textbook definition of an invasion. It's not a protest where people are standing holding signs and singing songs and chanting things. And what would happen if someone's trying to invade your country violently? You try to stop them. Now, the Israeli Defense Force began with, regular crowd dispersal methods like water cannons, and then, it escalated to tear gas. And then when those things didn't stop, then it became live fire. But when you look at who the casualties are, a huge amount of them are known Hamas militants. Hamas themselves put out, photos honoring the martyrs, as they call them. So that just proves that it's not indiscriminate shooting. They're shooting violent terrorists who are attacking using potentially fatal weapons.
OK, well, let's bring in Nour Odeh. You've been shaking your head throughout that, Nour. It is a fair point, isn't it? Hamas are encouraging people to go to the fence, to throw things across it, to try to breach that fence. Why shouldn't Israel defend itself?
Well, let's start with the fact that your guest said that these are not indiscriminate shootings, and let's review the facts. The fact is that among the 60 or 61 Palestinians killed were 7 children. The fact that this firing is not indiscriminate makes the murder of these children intentional and even more criminal. A paramedic was also among those who was
Don't twist my words.
2 days ago,
That's
as well
not what
as
I
a double amputee. Hamas is encouraging these protests, sure, but these protests are happening I did not interrupt you, madam. Please don't interrupt me. These protests are happening inside the territory of the Gaza Strip, a territory that still under international law is considered occupied. The whole world considers Israel still to be the occupying power, regardless of what Israel claims. These protesters were killed inside Gaza. They weren't killed because they breached the border. Many of them were killed at least 500 meters away from the border fence, a border fence that Israel moved further into the territory of the Gaza Strip. And by the way, water cannons were never used against these protesters in the Gaza Strip. A lot of tear gas was used, many indiscriminately and in ways that don't adhere to the standards or the rules of procedure that usually apply to the use of tear gas, and that includes the fact that these tear gas projectiles should be shot in an arc, not directly at protesters. We've seen injuries where people have received these canisters in the face and in other parts of the body, and they can be fatal. What is happening right now, and the casualty number speaks for itself, the fact that almost 3,000 Palestinians are injured just in 24 hours. Many of them will have permanent injuries. It has invited invited the condemnation of the majority of the international community. Something is wrong. Murder is not a crowd dispersal application that is acceptable in the international community. Live fire against unarmed protesters is not an acceptable or legal way of crowd control.
That is we've already established that they are armed and quite armed.
Is needed.
With deadly weapons.
Okay, Nour, thank you. We'll just pause. I should explain to our viewers that there is an enormous delay between Lahav and Nour, so it makes it rather difficult for them to speak to each other. So we'll try and do it individually if we could. Lahav, you know, whatever you say about what is actually happening at that fence, those images that were broadcast 2 days ago of Ivanka Trump looking very groomed and glossy inside the Israeli embassy and people being carried away from stretchers on the border with Gaza did jar for many people looking at them. What's been the response inside Jerusalem?
You know, think about the royal wedding happening on Friday. If there were, I don't know, Irish extremists attacking the UK, would the royal wedding be cancelled? For Israel, Jerusalem and this recognition of Jerusalem is even bigger than Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This is about, you know, recognizing our sovereignty and really the meaning of the state of Israel. You know, Jerusalem is the core, is the heart of Israel, is the reason that the Jewish people, the reason that it's our homeland. And so, you know, you're not going to call off the royal wedding, even if really bad things are happening not so far away, because it is a huge national event. Obviously, the photographs right next to each other are jarring, but I think that people can look at that and see that Israel is constantly facing threats on all of its borders, including from Gaza. Well, not all of its borders, because not Jordan, but we're facing threats from Gaza. You know, these riots have been going on since the end of March. They're not just about the embassy. They're called the Great March of the Return, because they want to invade and basically topple Israel. You know, the head of Hamas's military said he wants them to break through the border and to tear out the hearts of Israelis, which you might say, oh, it's poetic, it's, you know, theoretical, but these are people who have broken into Israeli homes and murdered sleeping children in their beds. So we take their threats seriously, and these are the threats that we constantly face. But at the same time, we can't stop living our lives. We can't stop the whole country, you know, from moving forward as much as we can when we face threats like this so often.
Nour, when we look at what's happening in Gaza, you talk about children being killed. There's a baby who died from the effects of breathing in the gas canisters, we understand.
Sorry,
I'm just putting this point
Health Ministry said
Nour.
that baby had a pre-existing...
Yeah. Well, a baby died. Anyway, Nour, what I was going to put to you is, why, if you are in Gaza, it is a small strip of land, it is densely populated, but if you know that there is going to be trouble on the border, why would you go near the border? Why would you take your children there?
Well, first of all, let's just explain to the viewers what has been happening for the past 7 weeks, because I think the geography of the protests are very important. The border between Gaza and Israel is quite long. What has been happening is that in several locations and about a kilometer away from the border, the actual border, there are tents, there are events, cultural events, educational events, there have been dances held, lessons held, all sorts of activities held, organized by the organizers who come from all walks of life, from the intelligentsia, from some of them are journalists and writers and poets, some of them are human rights defenders. They have organized all of those activities revolving around Palestinian rights, including the right of return, which is a right recognized by international law, not just for Palestinian refugees, but for all refugees. In addition, or next to these tents, about a kilometer away from the fence, there are protesters on Friday who approach the border but have not breached the border. All of the injuries throughout the past 7 weeks have been Palestinian, exclusively Palestinian. We're talking about protests, unarmed, well documented by international media. So this is not a figment of anybody's imagination. These are unarmed protesters inside their own territory, demanding their basic rights, human rights and national rights. You have an Israeli army, which is the regional military superpower on the other side, using live fire, using tear gas, and using artillery fire, as we saw 2 days ago, against these masses. I think it's quite bewildering for Palestinians to have the question posed to them, why protest, when the right to protest and to demonstrate and to organize is a basic right that is enjoyed in all democracies and in all societies that believe in the freedom of expression. These thousands of people are not a herd of sheep. They're not robots that Hamas can, push a button and send them all flocking to the border. There are serious issues here involved, and Palestinians in Gaza wanted their voice heard. They are still under occupation. They've been under a blockade for 11 years. They need the international community to pay attention, and they need these issues to be resolved. The fact that they're organizing peacefully was intended to communicate to the world that this is not about picking a fight with Israel. This is about engaging the world and even Israeli public opinion. And we've seen marches against these, Turkey shootings that have been happening, Turkey shootings that have been happening against the protesters inside Israel. We've seen human rights organizations in Israel asking the soldiers not to follow orders, not to shoot these protesters.
Okay. Last point, Lahav, to you, because we are running out of time. But do you feel that there is any hope at the moment for any kind of peaceful solution to what is happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians at the moment? Do you feel any renewed sense of hope?
That's an important question, but I think I need to address the profligate lying that we just heard. To call these protesters unarmed or peaceful is just a total falsehood. Is a Molotov cocktail peaceful? They are using deadly weapons. To say no Israelis have been injured, how many Israelis have been injured by Hamas through the years, even in recent months? Look up the picture of the Solomon family. The Hamas militants entered the bedrooms and killed their children in bed while they're sleeping. Or the Fogel family in Itamar. These are all members of Hamas. So to say no Israelis have been injured by Hamas. And when you talk about the right of return for refugees,
don't deflect.
Sure. How about refugees from 1948, but their children and their grandchildren? There is no in these marches. You're disrupting me now, Nour. There is no conflict on the planet where the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are granted refugee status, except for the Palestinians. There are not millions of Palestinians who are refugees of 1948, because there are not millions of Palestinians who were alive in 1948, and it's disingenuous.
They are refugees under the law.
Now, about the chances for peace.
Lahav and Nour, we are going to stop it there. There's no way we're going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in this forum, and also with an enormous time difference. The enormous time difference between the pair of you, that doesn't help either. So I'm going to stop you both there. But thank you both very much for coming on and trying at least